stretch for the human race. Got the end in sight, gotta pick up the pace to the finishing line at the edge of the old divide cliff. And strong, go out with a bang, gonna crash and burn, there's no reason to hang around. Let's go out in a blaze of glory. It was good while it lasted, but this good thing has come to an end. It was good while it lasted, but this is the end. Home stretch for the human race. Yeah, we took our turn and we trashed the place, turning rivers to sewers and forests to oceans of waste. But what goes around must come around, and what goes up has gotta come down. And the higher the peak, the farther the fall to the ground. It was good while it lasted, but this good thing has come to an end. It was good while it lasted, but this is the end.
The reason I call it die-off is because I see a really horrible future coming.
Hi everybody, welcome to tonight's live stream where you can, apparently, according to the title, ask an ecologist anything. So feel free to ask me anything. Thank you especially for showing up, for making the trip, as it were, the virtual trip. Thanks already to Susan Livingston for joining as a climate defender, and to Aaron Beerley for becoming a McPherson's champion. Hi everybody, welcome to... And let's see, do I see any questions yet? Lots of hellos. Hello everybody. From Michigan, I bet it's cold there. Midnight in the Netherlands. Go to bed, man. So, I'm open to any questions. And in the absence of a question, I'll start out with thank you, Jimmy John, for joining the channel. I'll start out with when I believe we entered the irreversible part of abrupt, irreversible climate change. The first paper I saw on the Aerosol Masking Effect was published by James Hansen and colleagues. They referred to no previous peer-reviewed papers, and so I thought that was in December of 2011. So I thought it was the first effort. Turns out, with a little digging, mostly by my friend Jackson Davis, there were a couple of dozen papers that preceded that one, already published in the peer-reviewed literature. The earliest one I found is from 1929 by somebody named Anders Engström. And that was, let me see if I can track that down. Anders Engström. Well, I'll try to track down the paper shortly. It's from 1929, and in the December 2011 paper by Hansen and colleagues, they concluded almost the exact same aerosol masking effect as did Engström in 1929, which tells me that there was essentially no change in aerosol masking for that entire time. Fast forward to February 2018 with Rosenfeld and colleagues. Seems like I always have the wrong paper in front of me. I don't know how I manage to do that every time.
It's up. It's on the screen.
The Rosenfeld paper is on the screen, so I'm not even needed here anymore. Okay, so the Rosenfeld paper indicates a new and improved way to calculate aerosol masking. This is in February 2018, I believe, and they conclude that previous work, and they specifically quote a 2013 paper by Levy and colleagues, and one colleague, and the paper by Levy and I can't remember who the other author is. Doesn't really matter right now. All this information is cited in my previous work at Nature Bats Last. And you can find almost everything having to do with aerosol masking by typing in aerosol masking in the search box or going to the Extinction Foretold, Extinction Ignored essay. In any event, quoting the 2013 paper by Levy and one other author, Levy and Orwitz, Rosenfeld and colleagues in their science paper from February 2018 concluded in an interview, not in their paper, but in an interview, that the aerosol masking had been underestimated by about half. And what they found in the paper was that aerosol masking had been underestimated, therefore there was a bunch of heating masked already that we could not find, thus the phrase aerosol masking. And beyond that, the paper was inconclusive. It was ambiguous. The Rosenfeld paper just indicated that the aerosol masking is greater than has been estimated before, and they cited some of the earlier papers, including the one by Levy and Orwitz. And then in an interview for Sustainability Times, I think it was,
That's the one. Yeah.
coincident with the release of that paper, Rosenfeld, the senior author on that paper, said in the interview that previous efforts had underestimated the aerosol masking by half. And so that tells me, since the Levy and Orwitz paper concluded that aerosol masking, as little as a 35% reduction in industrial activity would drive a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature spike. That was the finding by Levy and Orwitz. Along comes Rosenfeld and colleagues, and Rosenfeld in an interview said that underestimated by half. So that tells me that half of 35% is 17.5, we'll say 20%. So just to round up, I'd say as little as a 20% reduction in industrial activity will trigger a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature rise in a relatively short period of time. How short? The general consensus among climate scientists seems to be 6 weeks. James Hansen, in at least a couple of interviews, indicates that the aerosols all fall out of the sky without being replaced in 5 days. And there's a TimBob video that I posted recently at guymcpherson.com, including that finding from James Hansen, the 5 days till they all fall out. Okay, these aerosols are constantly falling out of the atmosphere, and we're constantly adding them back into the atmosphere. If we weren't burning fossil fuels, and especially coal, and we weren't burning everything else besides, all those aerosols would fall out of the sky in a pretty short period of time. From the perspective of biology and ecology, it doesn't really matter whether it's 5 days or 6 weeks. That's less than a growing season. So, for example, we've heard a lot about these fires on the West Coast, notably in Oregon and Northern California. Lots of smoke means lots of masking. That's one kind of masking. The most dominant kind of masking that the climate scientists have been writing about is sulfates from burning, quote, poor quality coal, conventional coal. But yes, fires do account for some aerosol masking as well. And this is reported from a paper published in 2017, I believe, that describes the Roman Empire at its peak burning wood and causing aerosol masking that affected all of Europe. So, the aerosol masking effect according to Hansen and colleagues, their finding in December 2011 matched almost exactly 1.2 plus or minus 0.2 degrees Celsius for all of the masking, matching almost exactly the finding of Angstrom from 1929. And then 6 years and 3 months later, along come Rosenfeld and colleagues, and they conclude that the previous estimates, citing the Levy and Orwitz paper, was wrong by half, that we'd overestimated by double. And I don't think there was a significant change in masking in that 6 year and 3 month period. Rather, I think there's just an improved technique for estimating the aerosol masking effect. So I suspect, because we were burning a lot of coal in 1929, in the 1920s generally, and we continue to burn a lot of coal with an additional few billion people on the planet up until 2011 and then until 2018, I suspect the aerosol masking remained about the same. What changed between 1929 and 2018 was the ability to accurately evaluate the masking that was going on. So I suspect that what this means is the time for reversing abrupt irreversible climate change was before the 1920s. The paper by Angstrom, published in 1929 again, indicates that aerosol masking was about the same as it was in December 2011, and continued analyses of existing data, especially satellite data, indicate that we have vastly underestimated the amount of masking. So I think we can go back about 100 years to the time, at least 100 years, before we find a time that climate change was irreversible. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change finally comes on board in September of 2019 with their special report on the ocean and cryosphere, and they conclude in that paper that climate change was irreversible, primarily because of heat stored in the ocean. So that tells me that we have to go back 100 years or so to find a time that climate change was actually reversible. And since none of us participating in this particular conversation are older than 100 years, I think we can safely assume that we were not responsible, any more than any of us is responsible for civilization and its continued persistence. This tells me, it provides further reinforcement for me of one of my overall messages of no shame, no blame. There's no point in shaming anybody. There's no point in blaming anybody for participating in this set of living arrangements that we were all born into. And that particularly makes no sense if the situation has been irreversible for the last 100 years. In fact, the only people who want to make a significant difference with respect to climate change are folks like Derek Jensen and Deep Green Resistance generally. And they want to dismantle civilization. Doing so would cause the abrupt loss of all life on Earth, the extinction of every species on Earth, because of a very rapid increase in temperature that would follow, and also because of the catastrophic meltdown of more than 450 nuclear power plants, which would cause, according to a recent paper by Tim Mosu and another colleague in Frontiers in Plant Science, would cause the death of all plants on Earth. So either one of those is going to be enough to destroy all life on Earth. And for the abrupt rise in temperature leading to that finding, you just need to point to the paper by Strona and Bradshaw, published in Scientific Reports in November 2018. So there's a couple of means by which we can actually destroy all life on Earth, and we seem to be pursuing both of them quite rapidly. That said, I don't think any of us can take a significant amount of responsibility for the ongoing destruction of the living planet. So that's the primary message I wanted to transmit. All right. So questions. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Jimmy John, for joining as a climate defender. What is the best thing we can do right now, knowing we are at the precipice? As I've been saying for many years, pursuing your own version of planetary hospice, I think, is about the best and perhaps only thing we can do. And I pointed out in, I think, my latest article for Weekly Hubris, ways to do that at 3 different levels. Societal, where we could focus on shutting down nuclear power plants, decommissioning them. At the community level, where we can pursue justice with respect to such things as misogyny and racism. And at the individual, in your home, family and friends level, I pointed to, as I have in a few interviews lately, I pointed to treating everybody around you as if they're your ancient, beloved grandmother, and treating people with respect and honesty as a result. So those are the things I think we can do. Have there been any recorded temperature increases due to the decreased industrial output from earlier in the year from COVID? Yes, many. Starting in China, around Wuhan, then proceeding to India, and then proceeding to a large area in Eurasia. And I've mentioned all these papers in my previous work with links to them. So with the aerosol dropping out, what is the next step? Fires are happening. Do we see more localized warming than the Arctic, the faster heating? I'm a little surprised we didn't have an ice-free Arctic this year. The extent of ice in the Arctic this year reached its low on September 15th. Generally does it on the autumnal equinox, plus or minus a few days, and that was about a week from the autumnal equinox. And so we have the Arctic with ice on it, as I pointed out in a recent interview with Political Misfits, and that's posted on the first page in the blog. We are already seeing some consequences that we thought would appear only with an ice-free Arctic, and we're very close to an ice-free Arctic. Will we see continued melting? Yes, I have no doubt about it in the years ahead. Now, there might be some variability. On the other hand, it could very well be that the loss of aerosol masking that we observed this year, it could be that will be sufficient to trigger catastrophic crop production this fall. Please pay careful attention to the soy and corn or maize production this fall. Those numbers should be coming up anytime between now and early November. And they could spell utter catastrophe based on warming, droughts, floods that we experienced earlier this year. Could be. I'm not saying it will, and I certainly hope it doesn't. Since the James Hansen 5-day aerosol masking effect YouTube clip is back on, do you think it will take 6 weeks roughly, or possibly less? And do you think we will lose severe aerosol masking in the coming weeks with collapse? I think that the biological consequences are already locked in as a result of what has happened since the pandemic began in early this year. We'll just say it started in February, March of this year. And I think the consequences around the planet will be sufficient to cause all kinds of adverse consequences for crop production. But we'll see. And whether it takes 5 days or 6 weeks doesn't really matter from a biological perspective. Obviously, that's a huge difference for us within our lives. But the important thing here is how it plays out biologically and ecologically, not whether the aerosol masking effect is complete after 5 days or 6 weeks, but what happens in the following period of crop production, and also what happens in the growing season for plants. We got really lucky when the aerosol masking effect was lost as a result of the pandemic beginning in late winter and early spring in the northern hemisphere, because the plants began to grow and continue to grow based on carbohydrate reserves from the previous year. So throughout North America, trees and other perennial plants were growing in the spring based on sugars, on carbohydrates they'd stored the previous year. So we're really going to be able to see some impacts, I think, later in the year. And by later in the year, I mean within the next couple of months. Is it true that tens of thousands of migratory birds in New Mexico fell out of the sky? Yes. Interested in your thoughts on why? Yes, I've seen that information from a variety of reputable sources. So I think it's in the Southwest, Arizona and New Mexico, not only New Mexico. And this is what happens when species lose habitat.
San Benedictine rock.
They die. And that's what's happening. Those birds are losing habitat. And in this particular case, I suspect it's food. Remember the insect apocalypse that I was writing and speaking about a couple of years ago? It's come home to roost, so to speak. There's no food. When there's no food, birds die, just like the rest of us. On August 1st, 1952, I believe it was, the San Benedicto Island off the coast of Mexico in the Pacific Ocean blew its top. It was a volcanic island. And I suspect it was that day that the San Benedicto rock wren, a bird, went extinct. Now, of course, it wasn't reported to be extinct until people could look around long enough and find that it hadn't flown to another island and taken up residence there. There were many nearby islands that to our human eyes looked good enough for the San Benedicto rock wren. Shows what we know, because they weren't good enough, because they were missing some element of habitat that we didn't know how to measure then and probably don't know how to measure now. So we don't know what it was. Was it loss of a particular insect that got the species through a particular season, like when the birds are nestlings? We don't know. All we know is that the species went extinct. There's a lot about habitat that we don't understand. Habitat continues to be a very vibrant subject matter in ecology and wildlife biology because we know so little about it. But I'd be willing to bet that all those birds died in the southwestern United States because they lost habitat in some form or other. I suspect it was food. These things can play out very quickly. So when people like James Hansen, who is not a biologist, not an ecologist, a physicist instead, when he says things like, my notion of humans going extinct within a short period of time, when he calls that crazy, I would argue that he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. He's not a biologist. He's not an ecologist. He has no formal education in either of those matters. He's a physicist. So he thinks we can solve anything. Loss of habitat, loss of animals, period. That includes human animals. Welcome, Stella Azul, to membership as a climate defender. Jeremy asks about, he asked me to explain the idea of reflecting mirrors on land and the feasibility. The project led by Dr. Ye Tao at Harvard's Roland Institute is, I think, our last reasonable chance to try to save habitat for our species. And I say that primarily because we are losing aerosol masking already, and the climate system is very sensitive to continued loss of aerosol masking, especially during the crop season, as I've already mentioned. Dr. Tao's approach involves painting the inside of glass orbs with a metallic silver colored paint. The inside so that them bobbing around in the ocean or getting kicked by small children in somebody's yard, the paint doesn't wear off that way. It's protected by the glass on the outside. Now, I just found out today there's another researcher who's pursuing a similar approach, but he's taking glass beads, which is basically silicone or sand, and the idea is instead of using it to reflect sun back into space from the surface of the earth on the ocean or wherever there's room for these mirror-like orbs to be placed, this other researcher, Leslie Fields, wants to fly over the dark soot that has been landing on ice and snow in the Arctic region and cover it. It's unclear to me how many times a year, once, twice, I don't know. Cover that soot with basically white sand, white beads of glass to provide some albedo, some reflection of incoming sunlight. So I hooked up the two of them, Dr. Leslie Field and Dr. Ye Tao, today, and hopefully they will work on these complementary projects that are both designed to reflect incoming sunlight. Now, the one I just found out about today with the glass beads reminded me of Jason Bach's research on Greenland. It's called the Dark Snow Project. It's called the Dark Snow Project, and you can find it online easily, because the dark material, soot mostly, that's falling onto Greenland snow and ice provides for increased absorption of sunlight and therefore heating up and melting that snow and ice even faster than was occurring. So I think there's a correlation between the MIRS project of Ye Tao and colleagues and the Leslie Field project of putting glass beads out on icy areas. So hopefully that'll show some promise in the future. Yes, back to Earth, that's why the stock market falls in October or sometimes early November, typically, is because of the correlation between harvest of grains and the stock market. Because we all know that every civilization requires bread and circuses. Circuses will be around forever because that's what governments do. But without the bread, without the grains, we aren't going to have the bread part of the show. So this is really important from a stock market perspective, because people who are pumping all that money into the stock markets know about the relationship between grains and continued persistence of civilization. Photos of the Arctic ice showed it to be a giant slushy in parts that showed as solid from satellite data. Yes, that's right. Not only is there the second lowest extent ever, second only to 2012, but the volume is much reduced as well. And so the ice that remains is very slushy. And that's not good. We've lost about 99% of the thick ice, more than 4 meters thick, since the mid-1980s. Since 1985, we've lost 99% of the ice thicker than 4 meters. And a vast majority of the ice that remains is very thin. So that does not bode well for the continued persistence of Arctic ice. I'm surprised we made it this year based on the paper projecting we would lose Arctic ice in 2016 plus or minus 3 years. So we made it through 2019, we made it through 2020 with ice still extant in the Arctic Ocean. And that paper published in 2012 was by Maslovsky and colleagues in the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences. I think that's the name of the journal. And so it was a little surprising to me that we made it this far without an ice-free Arctic. After all, the last date they were projecting was 2019, and we made it through 2019 and 2020 without an ice-free Arctic. Thank you, Back to Earth, for your donation. Yes, Stella, the rains came for the fires in the Pacific Northwest, seemingly at just the right time. But bear in mind what that means. That means loss of aerosol masking as well. So that might play out adversely in the months ahead. It's a little hard to tell. And it's really weird when it sounds like I'm pitching on behalf of large fires and the fossil fuel industry. I'm really not. I'm just pointing out the facts that if we lose even a relatively minor amount of the aerosol masking, if industrial activity is reduced by only about 20%, we have the potential to trigger the catastrophic meltdown of the entire climate system, including the meltdown of nuclear power plants and a rapid global average rise in temperature. I'm not happy about that, obviously, but that's where the evidence points. So yes, at least locally, it's pretty amazing that the rains came and cleared up the skies. And that's great, especially if you're inclined to go walk ever in the woods. Almost 400 pilot whales died off the coast of Tasmania. This is the largest stranding in their recorded history, and reasons are still unknown. Do you also suspect loss of habitat/food? Yes. And you know, it's so difficult to determine what all the aspects of habitat are, but it seems to me that in cases like this, when we're losing a lot of animals, it must be food. I can't imagine it's lack of water. These are pilot whales in the ocean. Water everywhere. Okay, not a drop to drink. So I suspect they're losing, and we know that we've lost a huge number of phytoplankton over the course of the last 40 years. And those phytoplankton obviously serve as the base of the marine food web. So that's going to play out over time, and that's been measured repeatedly now as having been a significant decline over the course of the last 40 years. You can find that information in the long essay, Climate Change Summary and Update at GuyMcPherson.com. Fine question, David. Guy and Pauline, what are your plans when shit hits the fan? A bunker or sharing your last can of peaches with your neighbor who isn't busting down your door? So, I've mentioned this a couple of times in these live streams, so I'll be brief this time. When I was a kid, and I know you love hearing stories that start out with when I was a kid. When I was a kid growing up in an exceptionally small village in an out-of-the-way place in northern Idaho in the 1960s and 1970s, my family always had a supply of food because we had to. There was a water tower in the village that provided pressurized water through the pipes even if the electricity failed, as it commonly did in the wintertime. But we would typically go to the real grocery store once a month. We'd drive Lewiston, Idaho, more than 2.5 hour drive each way to buy food once a month. And sometimes in the winter we couldn't make that trip when we wanted to. And so we always had a 6-week supply of food in our house. Now, it wasn't necessarily very good food. It was canned vegetables, but I didn't know any better. You know, when you're a kid and you eat this stuff, you just think this is what everybody eats, so it must be normal to do that. And so we are taking a similar approach here. We have enough canned food to last us 5 or 6 weeks. And we have a Berkey water filter. I hate to use a name brand, but we used many of those when we lived in Belize, and they did a remarkably good job at cleaning the water to make it potable. So we have the ability to filter water so that it's potable relatively indefinitely, and there are a couple of lakes within easy walking distance of here. And we have enough food to last 5 or 6 weeks. If we have a disruption in the supply of almost anything, certainly the food, and electricity that lasts more than 6 weeks, that's an indication to me that we don't have long. We already might be in that position because of loss of aerosol masking that is going to play out ecologically and biologically later this year. But if not, because of what we know about aerosol masking, we have stored away enough food to last for a while, and I doubt we'll be shooting the neighbors. We don't know them that well yet. I think instead that we will be offering what we have to people, but mostly because we know relatively few people here. Mostly, I suspect we'll be staying relatively quiet and making our last amends, since presumably at that point the internet will no longer be working and the electricity will no longer be working. We'll be sharing that time together, and it will be short. And we know it will be short. That's probably the most important part of this whole story, is if you know the time is short, and if you know specifically about aerosol masking, then and you're unwilling to live on a dead planet as I am, then that tells you to take advantage of the moments you have now and to be prepared for the moments to not last much longer.
Someone asked about Planet of the Humans.
Thank you very much, Chad Carter in Portland's Transport. Did you watch Planet of the Humans? Yes, sort of. One of us watched Planet of the Humans. We interviewed the director, Jeff Gibbs, for the Nature Bats Last radio show and had quite a vigorous conversation about it. He has been absolutely flamed for pointing out facts in that film. So it must be pretty good. And because we invited him to chat with us on the radio show, we are still in touch with Jeff Gibbs and enjoying that connection. He is an intelligent human being, and that film had something to offer beyond the normal, or he wouldn't be coming under such attack for it. Thank you, Kendra Zoa, for joining as a member, as a knight. We will have the knighting ceremony later when we bring out the swords.
And Eric Jackson. Eric Jackson joined.
Thank you, Eric Jackson, for joining as a climate defender. And let's see, Kendra says, I missed earlier Q&A. Did you address this? News reports say 2020 is second lowest Arctic ice. Does that stat account for the depth of ice and for the fragmented nature of the current ice? Yes, we talked a little bit about 2020 being the second lowest ice extent ever. I mentioned depth or thickness of ice, and somebody pointed out that it looked like slush up there. And so, yes, it's a thin, fragmented ice that we're skating on. And that makes the skating especially difficult.
Do you want to answer that pedomorphosis question? Do you know what that is?
It's up a ways, right?
Yes, let's see, what do you think that
Oh, yeah, I see it.
suffering from mental
Hans asks, do you think humanity are suffering from mental pedomorphosis? I have no idea. I don't know what mental pedomorphosis is. Can you look that up for me,
Sure.
Pauline?
I've asked him. People have asked him twice what that is.
Maybe it's just something he made up to keep us all distracted.
Sounds like it. Zoology.
It's just zoology?
Zoology. In developmental biology, pedomorphosis, or juvenification, is a phenotypic and or genotypic change in which the adults of a species retain traits previously only in juveniles.
So are we becoming childlike? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that. We've been infantilized. Infantilized, most of us since birth.
Yes.
It's one of the things this set of living arrangements does, this industrial civilization does, is it makes everything easily accessible. I can get whatever I want. I can order out for pizza even during a pandemic. So I think the infantilization is nearly complete. I don't think we have much time for further infantilization of Americans, at least. Other people might be more self-reliant. And from what I've seen in various places around the world, that's generally the case, although maybe not.
Erica has a really great question about the Gulf Stream stopping or slowing.
If the Gulf Stream were to slow dramatically or stop, wouldn't that produce a new ice age? I've read a hypothesis that is a fail-safe built into Mother Earth. Actually, sadly, no. And I wrote about this, and you can find it at the blog. And the resulting plunge in temperature would be less than the increase we've observed since the beginning of industrial civilization, much less the amount that's locked in due to the delay between release of carbon dioxide and its maximum heating, and a bunch of other factors that all point towards warming. Believe me, I wish we were headed for an ice age. That'd be the best case scenario, especially when you live in Florida, as I do. But for all of us. That's an interesting question. Do you think a person living in impoverished areas of this world feel lucky to be alive, or is that more of a thought born in luxury? That's a great question. I think you should travel to underdeveloped countries and ask everybody what they feel about being alive. Now, interestingly, we made a few friends while in Belize, and despite their poverty, some people were actually living with gratitude for every day. Interestingly, it had little to do with how much money or privilege they enjoyed. Other people who were remarkably privileged and wealthy by any standard were still miserable and did not act as if they enjoyed the time they were living in. So much of this is in here. So much of it is emotional and intellectual. And where does it come from? Does it come from your parents and your family and the way you grew up? Does it come from your formal education? Does it come from things you've read? I don't know. I suspect it comes from a combination of all those things as well as the genetics. But it seems to me there's this remarkable variation in the ability of people to accept life for what it is. We might refer to it as a stoic approach, or not. And some people, regardless of their circumstances, seem to be happy, filled with joy, no matter what you throw at them. And that's what I would call a relatively stoic approach associated with ancient Greek stoicism, but still persisting in many people. Thank you, Back to Earth 63, for your donation.
For herbal tea.
David Lutz, thank you for your donation as well.
Beer's more expensive than tea.
That's why I drink the tea and you drink the beer? Is that what's going on?
Beer taste on a tea budget.
Info piece, I think that's a question. Latent heating? What do you want to know? I need more information. I've talked about latent heating and written about it extensively at guymcpherson.com. So just tell me with greater specificity what you want to know about latent heating. Thank you, Back to Earth 63, for a beer for Pauline. She buys in bulk. That $5 is going to go longer than you think. She can stretch that out for more than one beer, I promise. Thank you, Hans Asperger, for your generous contribution. So just a few words about latent heat. Latent heat refers to the phase change between solid, liquid, and gas. And specifically with respect to ice in the Arctic or ice on Earth in general, and ice is good for Earth in general, the latent heat issue boils down boils down to this. It takes 79.2 calories of energy to melt 1 gram of solid ice into 1 milliliter of liquid water. 79.2 calories. If, once the phase change is complete, you apply that same 79.2 calories to the liquid milliliter of water, it will heat it quite abruptly to 79.2 degrees Celsius. That is really quite hot. You don't want to put that directly on your body. You don't want to shower in nearly 80 degrees Celsius water. That's really quite warm. So once you make that phase change from ice, for example, in the Arctic, to open water in the Arctic, all the heating from the sun that was going into melting that ice, contributing to the phase change, all that now goes into heating the Arctic Ocean. And that's very bad news, because a little bit of heat goes a really long way when it comes after the phase change from ice to open water. Am I wearing shoes? That's kind of a funny question. I'm actually wearing slippers. And is this the one? Yeah, this is the one with a hole in the heel. So I'm going to steal some of that money you sent to Pauline for beer, buy a pair of slippers, or at least one. I think the left foot is still fine. How often do you reflect on the direction you're headed with respect to these videos, and do you think you will ever be finished? Do I think I'll ever be finished? Yes. If you're referring to death as the finishing line, yes, I think I will be finished.
10 minutes.
And if you're referring to this particular live stream, we'll be done in about 10 minutes. However, it was only upon leaving active service at the university that I realized I was born to teach. I didn't have enough time to give it any thought before then, which is really an interesting statement because, as with everybody else in a tenured faculty position, I was paid to think. I was actually paid to sit at my desk.
Oh,
I wish I hadn't kicked over that full glass of water. I was actually paid to sit in my office chair with my feet up on the desk and my head back and think. I was paid to think. And how many people can say that? Not many throughout history. So it was a time of remarkable privilege, and I didn't take the time to realize that what I loved to do was teach. It was only after I left that I realized that I was pretty good at it and that I greatly enjoyed teaching. So I don't think I'll be done until the universe bids me farewell, or at least bids the internet and electricity and all these privileges we've come to take for granted until all that's done. So at this point, it's largely up to the universe when I'm done. Of course, there was a coordinated defamation campaign that largely removed me from public service. It almost completely destroyed my ability to tour. Not that there's a lot of touring going on now as a result of the pandemic. And it also destroyed my ability to conduct interviews with the mainstream media. Now, that was more than 3 years ago, and I see a little bit of potential for me to continue my teaching, not by touring, but primarily through interviews with what are considered mainstream or corporate sources. In particular, there's a couple of shows on Sputnik Radio, and I know that's Russian, that have done a good job. They're still corporate stations. And one of them I attribute to my early introductions with Jamarl Thomas. Jamarl was great, and he was wanting to be a journalist at that point, a paid journalist. And he just interviewed me for a few times on his YouTube channel. And it was an example of me being willing to submit to an interview with almost anybody. I received an email message today from a young person, I think in Kansas, who is going to have an interview with me tomorrow. And I don't know any of her credentials. I don't know if she's, quote, important or not. And Jamarl certainly didn't fall into that category of being important that is paid by the corporate media at the time I was submitting to his interviews early on. And then he got a big step up. He became a co-host for Political Misfits, and then he got a big promotion and became a co-host for Fault Lines. Fault Lines airs at drive time in the morning in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, 7 to 10 a.m. every weekday. And so that's a really big deal. And now I've been interviewed a few times on both of those channels, Fault Lines and Political Misfits, as a result of the commitment I made early on to be interviewed by somebody who wasn't well known. And I also think, I'm trying by pretty much any means necessary, at least any moral means necessary, to get this message out. And I remember submitting to interviews with a guy named Luke Canada on YouTube. And the first time he interviewed me, he had 2 subscribers to his channel. And he was surprised that I would do that. And I'm not. And it's not just because that Luke was college age, although I love interacting with people of that age. It's also because I'm trying really hard to get this message out, and if the interviewer doesn't end up defaming me, or interviewing people who do defame me on a regular basis, then I'm going to submit to an interview with them. And I think it works out great, actually. All right.
You might want to mention that if people want to comment or ask a question, this is open to public, but only members
Mm-hmm.
can ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
You wanna say
Okay.
that word?
So I should point out that only members can ask questions. Members of the Nature Bats Last YouTube channel can submit to the chat here. So there's a bunch of other people watching. Do you have any idea how many?
200?
A couple of hundred people watching now, and members are maybe a quarter of that, something in that neighborhood.
Yes.
So if you become a member, which costs as little as 99 cents a month, you can participate in the chat. Let's see. Somebody asked, Sandy, are you asking if Garland Nixon interviewed me? I don't know who that person is, so I don't think so. Maureen asks, do you have a specific motto in life? Any set of principles you live by? Yes, I live by principle and principles. For example, I won't submit to interviews with people who have defamed me. I get people beg me all the time, and then when I say no, because they defamed me 5 years ago, and now that it's obvious that I was right 5 years ago, they think they need to interview me. I was right 5 years ago, folks. It's not that I'm right now. I've been citing evidence for the whole time. So if you defamed me 5 years ago or 10 years ago through libel or slander, then I'm not going to submit to an interview with you, and I don't care how famous you think you are. That's one of my principles. I strive to be as honest as I possibly can. My motto, if I have one, is to live large, to be the best possible version of you that you can imagine, to be honest, to be compassionate, to be passionate about what you're doing. The line at Nature Bats Last that comes up on every single post is passionately pursue a life of excellence. We don't have long. Even if we live out our natural lives, say we live to be in our 80s or even our 90s, that's not long. That's 25,000 and some days. That's hardly any days. Some days seem longer than others, I'll grant you that. So, the things I commonly say are to live as though you're dying because the day draws near, to practice compassion with the people around you. I say a lot of things. No shame, no blame. At the edge of extinction, only love remains. I kind of like that one. Yes, Delaney, you're absolutely right. You write, I learned about global warming at the University of Texas in 1972 to 73. Kind of like Al Gore, we didn't think it would happen this fast. There wasn't significant evidence to support the idea of abrupt climate change until relatively recently in the scientific community. In fact, just about every month there's a new peer-reviewed paper that comes out indicating that climate sensitivity is higher than we thought. In fact, the planet is capable of warming much more rapidly than people thought was possible. And so, especially when it comes to factors like the aerosol masking effect, that couldn't be more evident. The rapidity of temperature rise that results in the wake of loss of aerosol masking or even a reduction of aerosol masking is way too fast for almost any organism on Earth to keep up. So that's a significant cause for concern. And There are other means by which the planet can heat or cool relatively rapidly as well. We don't know any way that we can cool the planet or even stabilize the temperature of the planet, but we know how to heat it up. We're really good at that. Is Peter Miller here right now? I don't think so. You know, Peter Miller, who has interviewed me for his channel now 14 times for his YouTube channel, but he has a pretty full life. He works for a living as a psychologist, and he has a family, and he still has some of his kids living at home. So I'm not surprised he's not here. He even took a break over the last couple of months with respect to talking with people for about an hour, as he had been doing for several months, about Planetary Hospice. And that was sort of his commitment to dealing with where we are, was to interact with people through the screens on YouTube and then release that information. And I think it was enormously helpful for a lot of people because they could see that somebody else was in the same situation they were. They were in the same intellectual, emotional condition that people were in talking with Peter. And Peter is a very good listener. He would ask a few questions. Those are some great recorded interactions. And so I'm not surprised he's not here because he has a life of his own.
It's 7:02.
Right. Also, it's 7:02. So it's 5:02 where he lives. So he's probably still working.
Right.
So there's that. Okay. And it is 7:02. So let's say we got another 3 or 4 minutes left here. So if you want to ask any questions, fire away. And otherwise, we'll be wrapping it up.
We'll try to do a brief live stream while we're on the road, maybe. Handheld.
We are, day after tomorrow, we are embarking on a large road trip that will take us all the way to southern rural Vermont from here. We'll be stopping to see Pauline's daughters along the way in Athens, Georgia, and then the daughter who lives in Queens we will see in nearby Connecticut. We'll also see friends along the way, including some people who are engaged here. Thank you for that. And so this whole thing is going to take about 2.5 weeks. We'll try to do a live stream twice during that span of time, but we'll see how it goes. And it's going to be holding on to the phone. It won't be nearly as professional appearing as this. I won't have this nice microphone. We just can't afford to haul all this stuff. We're taking a rental car north and then we're flying back down south. So we're not going to take a bunch of this equipment with us.
And tell them about the coincidence of the award ceremony.
And coincidentally, we are going to stay until October 12th. We're going to come back October 12th. So if you want to rob this rental house, that's the time frame. On the night of October 10th, Saturday, October 10th, there will be an awards ceremony for me being a recipient of the Jazz for Peace Honorary Ambassadorship. I'm the 5th such person since the Jazz for Peace organization, nonprofit organization, came into existence in 2002. Previous honorees include the Jean Quan, who is the first Chinese mayor in the United States. She was the mayor in Oakland. Ralph Nader, the famous consumer rights advocate. Howard Zinn, now deceased, the famous historian. And Dennis Kucinich, the congressional representative of some notoriety for his honesty. So those are the 4 previous honorees, and obviously I'm honored to be included in that group of people. That ceremony will occur Saturday from 8 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern time, I'll release details tomorrow afternoon, Friday afternoon,
It will
on the
be
blog,
launched.
and the ceremony will be live streamed as well, and that link will be included when I release the information tomorrow on the blog. So look forward to that at guymcpherson.com. He says in his bedroom slippers. These are not just my bedroom slippers. These are my whole house slippers.
All day long slippers.
Yes, I wear them pretty much all day. And the reason they have the hole in the heel of the right one is because I wear them outside too. When I go get the mail and chase down the Yorkies and so on. All right. So, no further questions have arisen. Let's just go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and thank you to the new members as well for joining the channel. And we look forward to giving this a try within the next week or so when we're on the road. So please tune in, check in on the Nature Last channel now and then to see when we're going to be doing the next live stream. All right, that's a wrap.